Analog warmth. So if you've heard the word analog warmth or warmth before, you're probably wondering, what exactly does it mean? You might have listened to a few tunes and been like, oh, it sounds warm, it sounds close, like it wants to give me a big hug, but you're not quite sure of the techniques involved to get you to that end result. Well, today I'm going to be showing you a few things you can do to achieve different types of warmth in your music. I feel like all of these techniques, when used together, can help achieve a really good, nice, crisp, warm result. So make sure you stick around for the full thing. But before we get into it, there's a little thing in the description for you, a little free gift that you should check out. So go check that out. But let's get straight into the content. The first thing I want to go over in this video is all about the low mid frequencies in your mix. Now, low mids frequencies, and I'll just bring up the EQ spectrum here, kind of range from this 100 to 300 hertz range, and they really give that warm feeling to a mix. If I get my music going here, and I'll play you this little beat I've made for this tutorial, you'll hear the kind of warmth in the low mids in this tune. Get the point there. It's a nice kind of warm sounding mix, and this is mostly due to this little keys sample here. Let me just turn off this pad for a second. Now if I bring this up here, it does have a high pass filter on it, but you can see based on the content, if I solo it, it's really quite dense around this 100 to about 400 range. What I'll do is I'll turn on a new band and I'll audition it so you can hear exactly the frequencies I'm talking about. It's a bit high. That's where that warmth is really present. Now, at the same time, this is a particular problem frequency in a lot of mixes, as in where too much of it can cause a lot of mud to kind of come in your mix, so you have to be careful. But delicate application of warming sounds can actually sound really good, whether it's just there from the beginning with the particular sound or sample you're using, or if you add it in. Now, what a lot of producers tend to do is they tend to cut out too much of the low mids, especially because a lot of producers tend to use this dastardly thing, which is a good tool but overused in my opinion, which is the ×4 curve. In other words, just really steep filters. They sound good for precise things, but they can really cut out a lot of the life in sound. So if I was to switch this to a higher slope, then you'll hear kind of the difference in sound. Especially if we bring it up. We lose all of that nice warmth down there. So I'm going to undo that and bring this back on. Sounds way better. Now, a gentle slope like this can be used to gently clean up the warmth if it's too much. But a lot of producers tend to take out too much and lose a lot of the feeling in that frequency range. So it's a good one to be careful of. I think in this piano sample, it's sounding pretty good overall. Let's get out of the EQ. But I am feeling like this snare could do with a bit more low mids. It's kind of got a lot of top end and a lot of kind of mids, but not a lot of this low end. So we might even give it a boost. That's a little bit. Let's see what it sounds like with it on and off. I feel like this sounds a little fuller in the low end, so I really like that. You could, of course, use an analog EQ, which is something I'm going to be talking about a bit later because it adds saturation and stuff like that, which is quite a warming effect. But for now, I'm really happy with that. Let's move on to number 2, which is the idea of pitch and volume modulation. These little pitch inconsistencies you'll hear in lo-fi or warm kind of sounding music will just give it this instability that kind of makes it sound imperfect but still like lovely, if that makes sense. To demonstrate, I've actually got that kind of effect on this main piano sample here. So if we hear, I've got after the EQ, I've got this RC20 retro color, which is a great plugin for kind of achieving retro effects. If I go into the plugin, you can see here I've got this wow and flutter preset, which basically adds pitch wobble, which is this module here, and a magnetic tape kind of effect, which is basically volume modulation, kind of what would happen if you're playing on a magnetic tape, which gets these little volume inconsistencies. Now, the magnitude or the dry wet of this effect is about 30%. If I bring this up 100%, you'll hear exactly how it sounds. There's a lot of effects, songs that use this type of effect, but I wanted something a bit subtler, so I brought it down. And without it, it just kind of sounds like the normal pitch, right? So this is a great way just to add a bit of warmth. You can see the movements there. It's a really nice effect. Now, you don't have to do it just in this plugin. There are a few other devices you can use this with. For example, if you're in a DAW like Ableton, you can actually use the auto pan as kind of a tremolo effect, simply by bringing the phase to 0 and then increasing the amount and rate to your desired kind of movement. The other thing you can also use is a frequency shifter. Now, I'll quickly demonstrate this because if you overdo it, it sounds a bit too weird, because a frequency shifter technically isn't changing the pitch. Bring the phase down to 0 on here and you can kind of get a kind of a weird warbly effect. Works slightly differently to a pitch shifter, so that's why you get a bit of a different sound. You can also use something like a vibrato plugin. I have the M vibrato from Melda Production, which you can kind of use to get other pitch effects too. You can bring it down, and you can also use tremolo in the same plugin, which is the nice little addition there. This is a free plugin, by the way. You can hear how those kind of effects just add a bit of extra interest to the sounds, and especially the pitch kind of gives it the vinyl type effect as if it's been played on a really old record, which is something I'll be getting into later in this video. Okay, number 3, we're going to be looking at the whole concept of filtering with a low-pass filter. Now, low-pass filters take out the top end of sounds. If I bring up the EQ again on here, so let's say bring up the EQ on drums, I could use a low-pass filter by enabling this button here, and let's unsolo the piano. Takes out a lot of the top end, which can be a nice effect in certain cases. Let me delete that, and I'll show you that on this lead, which comes in halfway through the song. The synth we've designed here is actually a heavily filtered sound. I've got a low pass filter with a frequency all the way down. This really cuts at any top end. You can actually hear it's a very bright sound without that filter. So this kind of just mellows the sound right out. I could even get away with using an extra filter on this sound, to be honest. And I could even automate it over time. It just makes the piano, which is already quite mellow, even more mellow. So it's a really cool effect because it, once again, emphasizes the low mids because that's all you're starting to kind of hear. Which is a really lovely effect there. So filtering is a great way just to kind of take all that harshness out of sounds and to really focus on that lovely warm stuff. So I'm just going to delete that there because I don't necessarily want it in this case. It's already quite warm for me, but I am using it in other cases. Great. Number 4 is using either compression, distortion, or saturation. Now these can be used directly on the source or in parallel, meaning you're using a dry wet signal to blend the clean signal with the dirty signal. Now I'm using different types of compression and distortion throughout this particular tune, so I'm going to show you a few ways in which I'm doing that. Now the first case I'm using it in is this bass here. Let me just solo the bass here. Now it's quite a low bass, and it's actually simply a sine wave just in operator here, which is an FM synth in Ableton. But you could make this sound in any synth, literally. It's all it is a sine wave, which is a pure tone. But I felt like that was good for that deep sub bass, but I kind of wanted to warm it up a bit to kind of get some upper rich harmonics, which not only help make the sound a bit more analog, but also help it reproduce better on non-bass heavy systems like phone speakers. So what I used is this Camel Crusher plugin. Now, unfortunately, this plugin's a bit difficult to find these days since the developer is no longer around. But if you do find it, you can use this or another type of plugin. There are plenty of similar ones out there. I'm just using the British Clean preset here. And you can hear if I turn it off, it just adds a bit of extra warmth in the low end. You can also see this if I bring in an EQ, go to our MIDI keyboard here. You can see these notes are kind of sticking around. Whereas if I turn this off, there's none of those upper harmonics. So it just warms up the sound quite nicely for me. And you can use that on drums, you can use it on music, etc. Now I could get away with quite intense saturation in this case. But I'm actually using it in parallel by using this mix knob. Because I don't want it to be a super intense effect, and using it in parallel like this can blend the cleanliness of signals that you still want to maintain with a bit of background warmth, which is exactly what I achieved here. Now I'm also doing this on the lead, which with lead sounds that already have a bit of upper harmonics in them, you kind of have to be careful with distortion and saturation because it can be overdone very easily. Now down on in the signal chain, I'm using Decapitator by Soundtoys. This is a great analog saturation plugin. You don't need this, you can use your stock saturator though. This is just a different type of effect which can achieve a very similar thing. I'm just cranking the drive quite a lot here, almost the maximum amount, but I'm also once again using it in parallel. To demonstrate, let me just solo this and I'm going to show you with it on and off to see how it sounds. It's a very, very, very subtle effect. If I bring up the mix though, you'll begin to hear the sound in a greater amount. So I just decided to use it in a more subtle way just to kind of give it a bit of richness without it being so obvious, which is once again, all these little ways we add warmth can just add up over time. Lastly, I'm also using some saturation on the drums bus. Not saturation, sorry, I'm actually using glue compression. Now using analog or analog modeled compressors can just help to not only add the compression effects you want by gluing things together in this case, but they also add a bit of saturation to sounds. To demonstrate this, I've got a glue compressor, which is the Ableton glue compressor here. There is a third-party one equivalent called the Cytomic the Glue, who also makes this version. But it's modeled after an SSL master bus compressor, I think it's called, which I think I've talked about in a previous video, which I'll now link in the description on compression. But this just also adds a bit of nice saturation, and you can hear by when I turn it on and off that it's not just compressing it, but certain harmonics and parts of the sound are brought out. Let me just solo the drums to show you what I mean. Let's turn it off. So the kind of upper mids are being kind of brought out a little bit more, and that transient on that kick has got a bit more top end. This is due to the way that the compressor actually works. If I was to use these exact same settings on a standard digital compressor, I would get the effect I'm after, but it wouldn't have as much, I guess, warmth in the signal, hence why I decided to use this compressor. So those are kind of the three ways in which you can use distortion, compression, and saturation to add a bit more warmth to your mix. Number 5 is going to be adding noise to your mix. You could use a standard kind of white noise, but I think interesting types of noise can really just make your mix a whole lot more interesting. In this case, I've got a vinyl or cassette kind of noise here in the background, which sounds like this. Really, really subtle effect, but it just makes everything a bit more crisp and warm. If I turn this off, you'll notice the piano in the intro sounds a little different. Versus this. And you can hear there that it just adds a bit more atmosphere and, like, I guess, old school feel in this case. Now, this doesn't just work in lo-fi. This works in a lot of different genres where you can add different types of noise to the background. You can also layer them together. So I could search through my sample library for some noise. Find one that kind of works. And you could use something like that turned down, unwarp it, turn this right down. You could even just loop a certain part of it over and over again. Now that amp noise is kind of a more subtle background effect as well, which kind of sounds nice, to be honest. But I probably won't use it in this case because it's not exactly what I'm after. So I'm going to delete it. But this is just to show that there's all sorts of... That's another type of noise. Each type of noise has its own characteristic and you can use it in ways to add different effects to your mix. Great. Number 6 is a similar effect to distortion, but it's bit crushing and downsampling. Now, unlike traditional distortion, which kind of drives the signal into a circuit or algorithm to kind of warm it up, bit crushing and downsampling kind of degrade the quality of the audio and kind of make it more lo-fi and digital sounding. But it can be a nice way to add warmth. Now, in this case, I'm actually using a particular plugin called RX950, I think it's called. I'm using it on the ride, and this is a kind of, I think it models the Akai 950 sampler, which is basically like a 12-bit sampler. It models the AED DA converter, which basically is the part that converts it from analog to digital and back. So it has imperfections due to the limitations of the technology, which kind of downsamples the audio. Downsampling, by the way, is basically how many times per second it's like listening. You've also got the redux effect in Ableton, which does this in a very basic way. If you hear this, I can, on the hat, I'll bring in the ride. That's a very basic version of the effect. And bit crushing or bit reduction kind of is more about how many levels of volume it can possibly be mapped to. So the lower the bit rate, or bit crush, the higher the bit crushing, in other words, the kind of more crunchy the signal will be, the more loud the signal will be. And it kind of adds almost like a noise to the signal. So that's kind of an obvious way of using it, but this RX950 is a more subtle kind of way. Now you've got input gain to kind of drive the effect. You've also got the filter and bandwidth to kind of mimic the downsampling. But it sounds a bit more kind of transparent because of the algorithm and the way this works, as opposed to the more digital version. So this is a more subtle way to achieve the same thing. You've also got things like a filter. So this is a really cool kind of effect because using these analog type effects can really help to just, add a bit of grit to things, which leads me on to my next effect, which is using all sorts of kind of retro or vinyl emulation type effects, I would classify the RX 950 as one of those, but you've also got other plugins. For example, I'm using the Vinyl by Isotope plugin on our lead down here, which I'm using it to warm it up and give it a bit of vinyl distortion, and also just kind of, it's got these warping algorithms which kind of add this pitch imperfection to it. Let me just bring it up here. You've got a few controls. You can add mechanical and electrical noise. You can add wear to it, which kind of adds some distortion. You can add dust and scratch kind of sounds over the top of it. Those kind of effects. You can also add warp depth, which is kind of like how much pitch modulation. You can also make it mono, and making sounds mono is one great way to kind of make it grittier and more lo-fi. For example, if I was to take the sample here and make it mono, you could kind of get a slightly different effect. Make it mono. Or you could like just take the left channel. Something like that to kind of make it more mono. That's a separate type of effect, but a lot of the old school technology that mimicked these kind of effects were only working in mono, hence why that's very characteristic of these type of warm sounds. You've also got the spin speed to kind of determine how fast the warp works. The year kind of determines the frequency response, so the newer models will sound more full spectrum. If I solo the lead, whereas the older ones will sound kind of more thinner, if that makes sense. So that's a great way just to add a bit of extra color. You've also got the multi retro effects, kind of like the RC20 I was using before. You can also bring another variety in. If I go to the multi effects here and bring in my RC20, you can kind of choose one of the presets here and see how they just add different bits of interest to the sound. I'm going to solo, I'm on the sample. Not that one. Stuff like that, just really cool effects to kind of just change things up and add a bit, obviously, more color to sounds. So that's really, really fun. Awesome. Number 8 is different types of reverb and delay. So you've obviously got standard kind of reverb and delay, which a lot of DAWs will come with, but you can not only use them in kind of analog or warm sounding ways, with like pitch modulation effects and stuff like that, but sometimes there are certain devices that are included with your DAW that do this as well. For example, if we take this little piano chop here I made, I'm actually using a preset of this echo device called Ethereal Cannon, and it's basically a combination of reverb and delay, and it's got a bit of noise and pitch wobble in there as well. And it kind of just adds this really interesting atmosphere to a sound that you couldn't achieve with just a standard reverb or delay. And it's just a really subtle, nice effect there. The other thing I've also got it on is I got some reverb on this vocal lead here, which is the Valhalla Vintage Verb. These kind of vintage verbs have like downsampling, which I was just talking about before, in the actual algorithms, this color algorithm here, which kind of give it a bit more of a noisier lo-fi feel. So there's certain types of reverbs that can do that. This is a paid reverb, but it's one of my favorites by far. There's also a few other things I'm using here, like on the high pad I'm using like the Valhalla Shimmer, which is kind of a more ethereal reverb. It's kind of a warm sound, but it's obviously a bit more atmospheric. I don't know if it fits into the context of this video, but it kind of just... yeah. Along with some kind of volume modulation on the auto pan here, it just sounds really cool. But yeah, using different types of reverb and delay in your mix can kind of help just add presence to certain sounds. That's imperfect, but warm once again. And I'm going to finish off with number 9, which is probably one of the most important, techniques that you should use in terms of achieving a warm mix. And that's simply just to be using the right sounds from the beginning. A lot of achieving a warm mix is using the right samples, the right synths, the right drums, the right effects from the beginning, and not having to use workarounds simply by processing the sounds to make them sound the way you want. Now, part of this obviously is sound design as well. You can be sound designing certain sounds in different sessions to make them sound the way you want to. But for example, the reason this mix I've got here sounds so warm is because I'm using this piano sample, which I got from Splice. Now, there's different ways you can kind of tweak different materials to make them sound good to work with. So this, if I go to the original sample here, it sounds like this. Now, what I did was I actually pitched this down using the repitch algorithm in Ableton. This kind of means that the pitch and the tempo are interlocked naturally. So when I slowed this sample down, the pitch changed, which is what would happen on a vinyl record or on a cassette tape anyway. And that kind of gives it this warm, low pitch down effect. Because when we pitch things down, we also lose a little of the top end character, which is kind of nice for this kind of warm effect. You can also get samples or sounds that have been run through analog outboard gear, which can be nice to use sometimes. You can get samples with a lot of the effects baked in here that I've already mentioned, or noise baked in or something like that. You can also get sounds that have these imperfections in playing. For example, this piano sample here, it's not perfectly on the grid. It's being played by a human and you can hear that. And just like alternating between those chops, you get this nice rhythm going, but it's slightly off in some ways. So just starting with good samples and processing them further to make them get what you want. You know, I'm not using a super aggressive bass sound with a lot of top end, so that really helps me there. These drums are like those sampled kind of hip hop drums, so they have a lot of that characteristic and just need a bit of tweaking to kind of get how I want them to sound. This applies to not just hip hop or those kind of genres. This applies to house music. This applies to techno. This applies to future bass even. This applies to pop. You can use these techniques to kind of get warmer sounds in any of those genres. Obviously, depending on your style, you are going to use different amounts of these effects and techniques. But I hope that you can walk away today with learning a bit more about how to achieve, you know, just more interesting, warm, and, you know, those mixes that want to hug you, I guess. So thanks so much for watching. Remember, if you liked this video at all, even just one part of it, make sure you subscribe because we're putting out regular content on this channel. And let me know which of these tips was your favorite, or if I missed something that I possibly didn't get to in this video. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Also, just give it a thumbs up down below. Just a gentle click. You don't need to smash it like everyone on YouTube asks you to. And lastly, just share this video with a producer friend who you think would benefit from, you know, getting these warmth kind of things in their mix, if that makes sense. So awesome, guys. Thank you so much for sticking around. It's been Aden from EDM Prod, and I'll see you in the next one.